What happens when America's most feared special operators come face to face with Australia's silent jungle ghosts? During the Vietnam War, the Navy SEALs were already legends in the making, experts in close-quarters combat, amphibious assaults, and hit-and-run tactics across the Mekong Delta. They moved fast, hit hard, and vanished before the enemy knew what hit them. But deep in the triple canopy jungle, they encountered something different, something quieter, something colder. They met the Australian SAS, not in a firefight, not as rivals, but side by side, assigned to joint operations deep behind enemy lines. The Americans called themselves Frogmen. The Australians, they were called Phantoms. At first it was curiosity, then confusion, then awe. Because the SEALs, masters of stealth by most standards, found themselves outmatched, not in firepower, not in aggression, but in stillness. In the kind of silence that made even breathing feel loud, in the kind of movement that didn't disturb a single leaf, in the kind of patience that waited, not for hours, but for days, to make one perfect decision. One SEAL later recalled, quote, "Zero. This is the story of what happened when two of the most elite special forces on Earth shared the same jungle and tried to learn from each other. It's not a competition. It's a clash of philosophies. A meeting of speed versus silence, action versus absence, steel versus shadow. And in the mud, sweat, and silence of Vietnam, they each discovered there was more than one way to disappear and survive. To understand what happened when Navy SEALs tried to match the Australian SAS, you first need to understand who they were and what they believed. The U.S. Navy SEALs were forged in water and fire. Born from the underwater demolition teams of World War II, they were built for speed, aggression, and flexibility. Their playground was the Mekong Delta, a place where rivers served as highways and ambushes came from reeds and shadows. SEALs struck hard, hit fast, and vanished. They used speed as a weapon, fear as a tool, and violence as punctuation. Their doctrine was simple: kill fast, move faster. Now place that energy in the deep, silent thickets of South Vietnam's triple canopy jungle, where visibility dropped to a few meters and every movement echoed louder than it should. Enter the Australian SS. Unlike the SEALs, the SAS didn't inherit their tactics from seaborne operations. Their roots came from long-range patrols in World War II's North Africa, and later, counterinsurgency warfare in the humid green hells of Malaya and Borneo. These men didn't crash through enemy territory. They melted into it. They didn't fire unless they had to. And if they did, the fight ended before it began. Their doctrine wasn't based on assault, it was built on absence. Disappear. Watch. Record. Kill only if absolutely necessary, then vanish again. For them, silence wasn't just tactical, it was sacred. So when these two forces found themselves on the same operations, joint patrols, shared reconnaissance zones, overlapping missions, the differences were immediate and jarring. SEALs moved in fire teams of 6 to 8. SAS patrols rarely exceeded 5. SEALs carried suppressed M16, M60, sometimes even shotguns. SAS operators carried L1A1 or cut-down .1 with 7.62 stopping power and often never fired a single shot during a week-long patrol. SEALs used their radios to coordinate, to flex. SAS troopers often left their radios off, speaking in hand signals, or not at all. One American team leader described his first night with the SAS, quote, 2. It wasn't arrogance, it was philosophy. Where SEALs saw opportunity for initiative, SAS saw risk of exposure. Where SEALs emphasized fluid momentum, SAS demanded control through absolute stillness. And in the jungle, the real jungle, not the reeds and deltas, stillness often won. But this wasn't about one being better than the other. It was about two elite units, each masters of their craft, suddenly realizing they were fighting two different wars in the same place. One war moved through water, the other hid inside the trees. One relied on rapid execution, the other on perfect patience. And both were deadly in their own way. What followed was not conflict, but quiet recognition, and the beginning of one of the most underreported tactical exchanges of the entire war. Because what SEALs and SAS began to realize was that they could each do something the other could not. When the first joint patrols between Navy SEALs and Australian SAS were approved, both sides expected mutual professionalism. They were elite, they were disciplined, they respected each other. What no one expected was the silence. For the SEALs, the operation started like any other. Insertion was smooth, comms were clear, weapons were loaded and checked. But after moving less than 200 meters into the jungle, things started to feel wrong. Not dangerous, not hostile, just off. It was the Australians. They weren't speaking, they weren't pointing. They weren't even looking around with urgency. They just moved slowly, deliberately, like they'd walked this trail 100 times before. No chatter, no small talk, no clicks on the radio. Just eerie stillness. Even their gear was muted. No clinking metal, no rustling packs. Everything wrapped, padded, dulled. Then, the first real test came. A faint rustle, maybe enemy movement, sounded just ahead. The SEAL point man instinctively froze and signaled to the rest of the team. But when he turned to check the Aussies, they were already on the ground. Flat. Silent. Gone. Not a whisper. Not a footstep. Not a breath. One of them had melted behind a root cluster so effectively that even the SEAL walking next to him had to squint to find him. The patrol halted. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. The jungle buzzed. Mosquitoes bit. Sweat pooled. But the SAS men didn't move. They watched, listened, waited. After nearly an hour of zero sound, the SEAL team leader whispered, "Do you see anything?" The Australian patrol commander didn't turn his head, didn't blink. He simply whispered back, "If they haven't seen us yet, they won't. Let's keep it that way." It wasn't just the silence that caught the Americans off guard, it was the discipline within that silence. They weren't being told to wait, they were being taught to disappear. The SEALs were used to tight formations, constant comms checks, and aggressive tempo. The SAS moved more like shadows detached from one another, linked only by instinct and trust. No radios, no markers, just an internal rhythm, honed by months, years of crawling through the bush in near total silence. By the end of that day, the Americans began to notice the subtle art behind the Australian method. The way they timed movements with gusts of wind, the way they paused when birds stopped singing, the way they angled their bodies to blend into broken tree lines or termite mounds. Nothing was random. And the most unsettling part? They made it look easy, one SEAL recalled later. They didn't move fast, but they never stopped moving. It was like trying to keep up with fog. That first patrol didn't end with a firefight. There was no contact, no blood. Just clean observation, smooth withdrawal, and enough intelligence gathered to plan a larger strike later. But something shifted on that patrol. The SEALs came in as equals. They left as students. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. The Navy SEALs, masters of maritime stealth, experts in rapid shock action, began to adopt the quiet, almost monastic habits of the Australian SAS. Not because they were ordered to, but because they saw results. The first lesson was movement. SEALs were already stealthy compared to conventional troops, but the SAS operated on an entirely different timeline. Where the Americans covered a kilometer in an hour, the SAS sometimes took an hour to cover 10 meters. At first, the SEALs found it maddening. Too slow, too cautious, too inhuman. But as they watched the Australians glide over leaf litter without a sound, and step between twigs like they had memorized the forest floor, frustration turned into fascination. SAS operators taught them how to read the jungle before moving, spotting broken patterns, shadows that didn't belong, foliage bent in the wrong direction. The second lesson was stillness. One night, the joint patrol settled into an observation point overlooking a suspected NVA supply route. The SAS didn't set sentries, they didn't rotate watches, they didn't speak. They lay down in firing positions and became statues. Minutes turned into hours. No one shifted. No one scratched an itch. No one even adjusted their gear. The SEALs held their breath, waiting for someone, anyone to move. but the Australians didn't. And just before dawn, the reward came. A faint silhouette. Then another. Then a column of NVA soldiers marching right into the kill zone. A SEAL whispered, "How did you know?" The SAS patrol leader murmured back, "Because the jungle went quiet." It was a level of sensory intuition the SEALs had never seen. Another lesson was managing signature. Every scent, every sound, every glint of metal. The SAS wrapped buckles in tape, dulled their blades, kept food unscented, and rubbed mud on bright surfaces. They removed brand labels, stripped reflective paint from gear, and even rearranged equipment so nothing clicked. SEALs took note. They had stealth experience, but not like this. Finally, the most surprising lesson was restraint. During one patrol, the combined teams spotted 3 VC soldiers walking down a narrow trail, unaware they were being watched. A SEAL raised his suppressed rifle, ready for a quick 3-round burst, but an SAS corporal gently touched his arm. "No shooting," he whispered. "We need the rest of the column." So they waited. 30 minutes, then 40. And finally, the main supply element appeared, over 100 strong. The SEAL lowered his rifle, almost embarrassed by the earlier impulse. Later he admitted, they didn't just see the battlefield, they saw the logic behind it. By the end of the joint mission, the SEALs had absorbed invaluable lessons. How to slow down, how to vanish, how to gather intelligence without announcing their presence. They came to Vietnam believing they understood stealth. The SAS showed them what stealth really looked like. While the SEALs were quietly absorbing the Australian art of disappearance, the SAS were watching too. And though they rarely said much, they took note of the Americans' speed, their improvisation, and their gear. Because for all their mastery of silence, the Australians understood a simple truth: adapt or die. The first thing that stood out was technology. SEALs came armed like jungle commandos from the future. Short-barreled suppressed M16 variants, CAR-15S, M203 grenade launchers, and gear that had clearly been tested under fire. Their kit was lighter, modular, and packed with clever solutions. Their radios were newer, more compact, their hydration systems more efficient. And when it came time to exfil quickly, they could pack up and move in half the time. One SAS trooper admitted, quote 11. SEALs also brought an aggressive strike doctrine that impressed even the quiet professionals of the SAS. When an opportunity appeared, they acted fast, too fast sometimes, but often with surgical precision. Where the SAS might wait days to stage a perfect ambush, the SEALs had refined the art of hit, extract, and vanish within minutes. There was also a creative energy in the way SEALs approached problems. They weren't bound by rigid doctrine. They modified their weapons constantly. One trooper carried a shotgun with custom shell racks. Another had jury-rigged a strobe onto his compass. If something didn't work, they replaced it or reworked it. They were tinkerers, warrior engineers. And the SAS, who normally relied on standard-issue gear honed by habit, saw the benefit in that. On one patrol, the SEAL team's radio man quietly offered to show an SAS signaler how they secured their antennas to avoid detection. They used a tight spiral wrap, lowered signal gain, and carried backup batteries in waterproof containers rigged from cut-down MRE packs. The SAS copied it. Later, one of their patrols used the exact setup to call in an emergency extraction during a monsoon with zero interference. But what struck the SAS most was SEAL mobility. Their command of terrain, especially near rivers, swamps, and tight trails, was phenomenal. They could infiltrate a target from water at night, strike, and be gone before the jungle fully registered what had happened. The SAS, for all their land-based skill, rarely operated that fluidly near water. Watching the SEALs maneuver by riverboat or silently insert by paddle brought new tactics into the SAS playbook. And in moments of heavy contact, the Australians saw just how lethal the SEALs could be when speed, coordination, and firepower came together. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled aggression. So while the SEALs learned how to disappear, the SAS learned how to move faster, adapt smarter, and strike harder when needed. It was never about imitation. It was about respect. Two elite forces, two philosophies, and between them an unspoken understanding. Even the best still have things to learn. It was deep in Phuoc Tuy province. Dense jungle, monsoon wet, crawling with movement, that a joint SAS SEAL reconnaissance mission was launched to monitor and, if possible, ambush a Viet Cong supply trail feeding into the Long Hai Hills. The intelligence was solid. A logistics column was expected to move through the area within 48 hours. Both teams had worked together before. Both respected the other. But this time, the pressure would reveal just how different they truly were. The SAS patrol arrived first, having inserted the night before under total darkness. They took up hidden observation positions on an elevated slope overlooking the trail, covered in leaf litter, camouflage netting, and stillness so complete that even local insects ignored them. Every route of escape was pre-planned, every angle of fire rehearsed. They didn't move. They didn't speak. When the SEAL team arrived by foot the next morning, tired from pushing through a flooded lowland, they were surprised to find no visible trace of the Australians. Only after a quiet, prearranged signal did the SAS emerge from the foliage, faces painted green and black, eyes calm, rifles held like extensions of their arms. As the hours passed, the Americans began to fidget. Rain came in waves, mosquitoes swarmed, visibility dropped. Nothing moved on the trail. The SEALS suggested repositioning, maybe pushing forward, getting closer to the trail bend to improve field of view. The SAS leader shook his head. He said. By the second day, tension grew. The SEALs were ready to act. The SAS were still statues. Then, finally, just before dawn, movement. Shadows slipped between trees, packs, rifles. The sound of quiet footsteps in mud. The SEALs prepped for contact. Targets were inside 20 meters. A textbook ambush. Except the Australians didn't signal. No trigger, no shots. Because this wasn't the column. It was the scout element. Forward observers meant to bait a response. The SAS waited. An hour later, the full column emerged. Dozens of men, some armed, others carrying crates of ammunition and medical supplies. The Australians were ready, but by then, the SEALs were antsy. One of them radioed a whispered request. The SAS patrol commander responded in a near-silent voice. It was clinical, measured. When the signal finally came, it wasn't a yell. It was a soft click. Then, hell exploded. 7 seconds of controlled fire. No screaming, just muzzle flashes through mist, steel through flesh, then silence again. The jungle swallowed the echoes. Before the enemy could regroup, the SEALS launched smoke, and the SAS initiated their withdrawal routes. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, blood pooled into the mud. The column had been split, stunned, and shattered in a single breath. It worked. But afterward, during extraction, the contrast became clear again. The SEALs buzzed from adrenaline. The SAS, calm, quiet, resetting their gear. One American joked, quote 16. The SAS trooper replied flatly, quote 17, different speeds, same direction. But the jungle remembered who moved first and who waited longer. In Vietnam, respect wasn't earned through rank, medals, or the number of firefights survived. It was earned in the mud, under the canopy, in the space between one breath and the next. For the Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS, it wasn't friendship that formed in those joint missions. It was something deeper. Mutual recognition. Warrior to warrior. After the ambush, the SEALS were full of questions. How had the SAS known it was only the forward scouts on that first pass? How had they timed the ambush so perfectly? How had they moved so silently while fully armed, exhausted, and soaked? The Australians didn't brag. They didn't explain much. They just cleaned their rifles in silence, checked their boots for leeches, and repacked their gear. But in that silence, the SEALs began to see it. This wasn't just a skill set. It was a mindset. These men didn't just know the jungle. They had surrendered to it. They let it shape their tempo, their instincts, their judgment. One American SEAL officer quietly admitted later, quote 18. The respect flowed both ways. The SAS saw in the SEALs a kind of controlled aggression they didn't often allow themselves. When the time came to strike, the Americans moved like lightning. Their communication was sharp, their fire discipline tight, and their ability to break contact under pressure was impressive. In the debriefs, SAS troopers often noted, "They were louder than us, but they weren't sloppy." And that mattered. Because in jungle warfare, noise was sometimes necessary, but only when every bullet had a reason. By mid-1969, SEALs in the Delta and along the coast began requesting cross-training opportunities with SAS patrols stationed inland. Not for joint ops, but to learn. To understand bush movement, long-term camouflage, jungle hygiene, trail discipline. To understand how to disappear. In turn, SAS teams began experimenting with lighter American gear, trying out modified webbing setups, incorporating elements of SEAL short-duration strike tactics for specific missions, especially when speed mattered more than invisibility. They weren't trying to be like each other. They were refining their own edge. And while neither unit ever openly admitted it, they began tracking each other's lessons quietly. SEALs started packing lighter. SAS troopers began carrying smaller radios. Even slang bled across. Aussies started calling some fast recon insertions SEAL drops, while Americans began referring to long-duration passive recon as ghosting, a nod to the Australian way. They never called it rivalry. It was evolution. One SEAL said it best after a joint mission. "We didn't come back trying to be them. We came back more aware of what we weren't, and what we could be." In the crucible of Vietnam, under the weight of rain, fear, and discipline, two elite forces forged something rare. Respect without words, lessons without lectures, brotherhood without needing to say it. When the war ended, both the Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS packed up their gear, cleaned their weapons one last time, and disappeared from the Vietnamese jungle. The trees closed in behind them. The trails they once patrolled were swallowed by foliage. But something remained. Something that didn't rust or rot. Legacy. For the SEALs, Vietnam was the crucible that shaped them into what they are today. It was in those jungles, river deltas, and hostile villages that they learned how to blend aggression with restraint, firepower with finesse. But it wasn't all learned alone. The missions with the SAS left a mark. Not in tactics, not in doctrine, but in the small things. How to move slower. How to listen deeper. How to wait when everything in your blood is screaming to act. Veterans who walked beside Australian SAS teams came back with a sharpened edge. They passed it on, not as orders, but as whispered advice to new operators. If you want to learn patience, follow an Aussie through the trees. For the SAS, the SEALs were a glimpse into what was possible when speed, firepower, and boldness were weaponized correctly. The Australians never tried to copy the Americans, but they respected their relentless push, their refusal to be intimidated. And they took pieces of it with them. Not because they had to, but because every edge counts. Some of those SEALs would go on to command future generations. Some of the SAS would later train the next wave of ghostwalkers for other conflicts in Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq. And the lessons from Vietnam, carved into muscle memory in monsoon rain, never left. Years later, at joint training exercises in the Australian outback or California desert, operators from both nations would find themselves on the same range, the same trail, the same team. They'd nod once, no words needed. Because the bond made in Vietnam wasn't forged in campfire stories or medals. It was made in the shared silence before an ambush. In the look across the jungle floor when both sides realized, we fight differently, but we fight for the same outcome. Victory without waste, precision without pride. Violence only when it means survival. Today, when historians speak of elite units in Vietnam, they talk about Navy SEALs with their riverine raids and high-value targets. They talk about SAS patrols tracking the enemy for weeks and vanishing before detection. But they rarely mention the space where those two worlds overlapped. Yet in that space, quiet, humid, and deadly, a kind of brotherhood was born. Not of nation, but of mindset. And that brotherhood still whispers through the ranks today. Every time a special operator holds his breath, waits longer than feels comfortable, and strikes only when the time is right. Just like the Phantoms once did. just like the SEALs learned to do, in a jungle that never gave second chances.